The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Jesus said to his disciples, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that bears no fruit, he cuts away. And every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes to make it bear even more. You are pruned already by means of the word that I have spoken to you. Make your home in me, as I make mine in you. As a branch cannot bear fruit all by itself, but must remain part of the vine, neither can you, unless you remain in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Whoever remains in me, with me in him, bears fruit in plenty. For cut off from me you can do nothing. Anyone who does not remain in me is like a branch that has been thrown away. He withers. These branches are collected and thrown on the fire, and they are burnt. If you remain in me and my words remain in you, you may ask what you will, and you shall get it. It is to the glory of my Father that you should bear much fruit, and then you will be my disciples. The Gospel of the Lord. If Jesus were alive today, his parables would be about satellites and jet planes and GPSs and all these kind of things, television shows. But his parables were about things that were common to the people of his time, and sometimes they're a bit difficult for us. Like last week we had the shepherd and the sheep. I had brothers-in-law who had thousands of sheep. There's no kind of deep personal relationship between a grazier and his sheep these days in Australia, but that was the way it was. And also many people wouldn't know much about growing grapes and trimming vines and all that kind of thing, living among tar and cement. But in his time that was such a familiar image. A vine, and then they all knew what had to happen. They had to be trimmed, and if the dead branches cut away, and so on. And they all understood that the vine gets all its life from the sap, and the sap comes through the vine and passes from the vine out into the branches, and that's how they're able to put out leaves and then bear fruit, bear the grapes, and from that they made the wine. Well, Jesus is then saying, I am the vine, and you are the branches, and you've got to bear fruit. So in the vine, the sap comes through to nourish the branches. In the case of Jesus, it's the sacraments that he's given to us to nourish us, and most of all, particularly, of course, the Eucharist. It's when we eat his body, drink his blood, that's what gives us the strength to go out and then to bear fruit. And what's the fruit? Well, the fruit is the good works that we do. In the second reading, it talked about loving. Now, love is not to be just words or mere talk, but something real and active. So if we're close to Jesus, and the closer we are to him, the more we drink from these sources, the more fruit we are able to bear. So it's very sad when people cut themselves off from the Eucharist. I was at, was it last weekend, I think it was, or the weekend before, I was in Geelong. We had 100 years since our minor seminary began, the Redemptorist Seminary in Geelong. Geelong's out in the country, roughly in the Canberra direction. And we had 78 old boys came back. It was organised by them, so there were 7 or 8 of us that went on to be priests and are still priests. But the others there were ones who went off and had many different careers. Many of them were happily married and brought up good children and so on. But when we had our centenary dinner, I was sitting at a table where there were 4 people and they'd all given it away. It was very sad for me to think there. They'd been young boys, they'd given their lives to Jesus, it didn't work out, but now they're not coming anymore on Sundays to nourish themselves at the Eucharist. And so it wasn't surprising that a couple of them into all kinds of things like numerology and New Age. They said, well, we're still spiritual. But yes, but spiritual in a way that can mess your life up. So we really don't ever give it up. We need our Eucharist every week. And if we have sinned, we need to receive His forgiveness so we can worthily receive. And then if we do, the closer we are, not only the Eucharist, but also adoration. You do have adoration, don't you, afterwards? And before, is it? Yes. And it's good that we be devoted to adoration. The more we spend time with Jesus, the more we are strengthening ourselves to bear fruit. And the fruit, well, we have Julie and Joe here. They have borne all this fruit. I guess all of you could say, in some ways, we're the grapes flowing on the vine planted by Julie and Joe. So obviously they're people who are very close to Jesus. When reflecting on this, the person that came into my mind was Saint Damien of Molokai. You probably know the story of Damien of Molokai. He was a Belgian young priest. He went out there. Molokai was a hellhole when he went there. It was a place where they dumped all the people with leprosy. In those days, there was no cure for leprosy. It was a horrible disease. People lost their hands and their feet and even their noses. And they were dumped there. There was no hospital. There was no care for them. There were no schools. It was an abandoned place. And it was a hellhole too, because in their misery and despair, there were all kinds of orgies going on, sexual orgies, drunkenness, everything like that. That was the kind of place that Damien went to. Well, he went there and he started off by setting up a little chapel, having Jesus there and spending hours with him, saying Mass every day and spending hours with him in the Blessed Sacrament. And then he began to go out and to minister to them. He looked after them, he cleaned out their houses, he washed their sores, he tended them. But he did more than that. He lobbied governments to set up a school, a hospital. He brought in a congregation of nuns to look after them. He did all these things. He so heroically gave his life that eventually he contracted the leprosy himself and died of it. But all of his strength came from this very close relationship with Jesus. It all came from the Eucharist. It all came from the hours that he spent together with Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament. So the more we are close to him, the more we draw from the sap in the vine, the more fruit we're going to bear. We're all called to bear fruit, every one of us. And the new letter I'm looking forward to reading it. You'll probably hear more from me about it when it comes out. Be glad and rejoice. The letter of Pope Francis, produced 2 or 3 weeks ago, on holiness. And holiness, living holiness in our world of today. And it's for everyone. Every person called to it. And we're all called then to be close to Jesus and to bear fruit. And if we don't, if we allow ourselves to wither, well, the Gospel says, anyone who doesn't remain in me is like a branch that's been thrown away. He withers, these branches are collected and thrown on the fire and they're burnt. The ultimate thing for people who cut them off from Jesus, who've had all the opportunities we have, they could finish up in hell and cut off forever in the fires of hell. So it's very clear, the message of the Gospel today. Jesus is the vine, we are the branches. So whoever remains in me and me with him bears fruit in plenty. He prunes us too. What's the pruning he does? Well, sometimes it's the difficult things that happen in our life, the sufferings and the crosses. But he said, yes, you're pruned. Every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes to make it bear more. I bet that you've had a bit of pruning in your lives over the years. You don't bear lots of fruit without a bit of pruning, but it's loving pruning. Might seem difficult at the time, but it's amazing the way God draws good out of all of these difficulties that we have in our life. So today we ask, as we prepare ourselves for the celebration of the Eucharist and making present the sacrifice of Jesus on the altar, and as we prepare our hearts to receive him in Holy Communion, we ask him to let his sap flow generously into us, to help us to bear much fruit and to follow him with all our hearts.